Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
Welcome to this edition of Access to Democracy. I'm today's guest host, and we have a very special guest with us today. Is it okay for me to say you're an iconic figure in Minnesota and very close to becoming a legend?
Well, only if I get to say the same about you, Justice Andersen.
Anyway,
great to be with you today.
Our guest is Lori Sturdevant, a journalist, author, and public citizen, because you are around the state promoting very different things. So very good to have you with Lori. Are you a native Minnesotan?
I am not.
You are not?
I am a native South Dakotan, grew up very close to the Minnesota border in a little town called Dell Rapids, north of Sioux Falls.
Okay, what brought you to Minnesota?
Oh, you know, as you know the history of Minnesota and this region, you know that the eastern part of the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, are really part of the economic watershed of this whole area.
Don't tell any South Dakotan that.
Yeah, well, but if they know their history, it's true. In my little town, as I would visit the bank on Main Street, the sign on the bank would say Northwestern National Bank of Minneapolis.
Really?
On the Main Street of Dell Rapids. So we always knew where the center of gravity was for economic gravity for our region. I would come up to the Twin Cities for Twins games and for shopping trips and do some fun things with my parents growing up. And I always read from beginning about age 8 or 9. My parents subscribed to the Minneapolis Tribune. I wanted
to raise that because Minnesota has benefited by so many people who were born in South Dakota. Roy Twilliger, Judge Paul Magnuson.
Hubert Humphrey.
And yes, Hubert Humphrey.
Yes.
I mean, and I talked to Skip, and it was in South Dakota that some of the roots of his equality thinking started there.
Hubert's mother grew up on a farm very close to where my parents worked and lived for 40 years.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And so you come to Minnesota. What did you do? How did you get into journalism?
Oh, I wanted to be a journalist. Growing up, because my parents were kind enough to subscribe to the Minneapolis Tribune beginning when I was about 9 years
old.
old.
Huh?
No, the Tribune was put on a train about 6 o'clock at night and sent to the eastern parts of Dakotas, both Sioux Falls and Fargo, and I think Grand Forks would receive those daily Tribunes. So I was able to come home from school and read the Tribune, which had come over the course of the day. Always enjoyed reading the Sunday Tribune, reading the Tribune during the day, wanted to work for that newspaper. As I became as I became interested in journalism and was my high school newspaper editor, worked for the town paper, the Dell Rapids Tribune. I always wanted to work for the Minneapolis Tribune. So coming out of Coe College, I enrolled in the journalism school at the University of Minnesota and started applying, and lo and behold, they hired me when I was 22 years old.
I bet you in school you had no problem when the teacher said, bring in an article about current events, right?
Oh, I was always on top of current events. I was a news junkie as a kid.
Okay.
Wouldn't miss Walter Cronkite every night.
So when you started out in journalism, what did you do? Were you a cub reporter, or what did you report on?
Just the old-fashioned track. You start out as night general assignment, writing anything and everything that comes along, including taking dictation from the political reporters who are out traipsing around with the likes of Walter Mondale and other candidates from Minnesota in those days. But I quickly realized that all the top editors at the paper had at one time covered the Minnesota legislature. And along came the 1978 election, an election in which we had, as we have had rather recently here, 2 U.S. Senate seats and a governor's race and the Minnesota House all on the ballot, and a political change a-coming. You could kind of feel it that year. The Democrats had a big...
I'm not sure the Democrats saw it coming.
Well, if they didn't, they should have, because they had super large majorities after Watergate, and that wasn't in keeping with the Minnesota history or tradition, and likely wasn't going to last. So the editors at the newspaper looked around for people to help out with this election, and they assigned me to cover Al Quie. And I think they did so because they were thinking he was the least likely of these big statewide candidates to win, and we'll give the young girl reporter Al Quie, and of course he did win. And that landed me in the basement of the Minnesota Capitol.
Now, Al is one of my mentors, and I don't. So what was it like? I mean, he's still alive, iconic in many ways, and such a decent thing. What was it like covering Al Quie in that race?
Oh, he was such a gentleman. Always a delight to be around. Treated the traveling journalists who were with him with great respect, and gave me access. I remember at one point having access to him in his apartment, the apartment that he and Gretchen had rented during that campaign in the Twin Cities. He was eating a TV dinner, and she was reclining on the sofa, and they were talking to me about their marriage and their lives. And I thought, what a privilege it was to have that kind of access to Al Quie.
You know, there's an apocryphal story. Al Quie was a military pilot, and that he flew upside down over St. Olaf to impress Gretchen.
I don't think that's apocryphal. I think that happened.
No, he did it, but it wasn't Gretchen he was trying to.
Oh, that
was another girl. But so those are some of the things. But so you've met a lot of Minnesota figures, and we have a book here on Elmer L. Andersen.
Yes.
And this is kind of a point where you've made a transition from. And you didn't leave one field, but you made the transition to be an author. Tell us about that.
Well, beginning in about 1998, 1999, I had an opportunity to be a ghostwriter for Elmer L. Andersen, the former governor, who was at that point in his about 90 years old. He turned 90 in 1999. And he had wanted to do a memoir, but his eyesight was failing.
But there were people that, not only Elmer wanted, there were people that really were
encouraging
saying,
him.
You have to do it, Elmer, right?
Well, an amazing life, and one that I fear may have been, some of the aspects of his life may have been lost if we hadn't done this book. I was so honored when I was approached by Elmer and his good friend Tom Swain to do this book, and it became a very significant relationship in my life and a real privilege to help tell that story.
Well, you mentioned a name, Tom Swain. What was the relationship between Elmer and Tom Swain?
Tom was Elmer's campaign manager in 1960 and was his chief of staff when he was governor for the first year of the governorship. And in those years, the legislature just met in the odd-numbered years, so Tom saw Elmer through that first and only legislative session. And then Tom, after Elmer was defeated by Karl Rovag by only 91 votes in the...
Still the closest governor's race in the country?
In the country, in U.S. history, that's right. Then Tom went on to an insurance career and then a University of Minnesota career, but he stayed as such an active citizen that as someone who was covering politics, I met him somewhere along the way, and we had become friends as well.
But Lori, Elmer L. Andersen only served one term as governor, 2 years plus about the 4 months when the recount was going on. So why is he such an iconic figure?
Much of his influence was actually both before and after his governorship. There was a significant but not a particularly momentous governorship, being only 2 years long. But his role as a state senator in passing civil rights legislation, working with Don Fraser, I may say, as an ally in the state Senate, to have bipartisan civil rights legislation it was exceedingly important. He continued to work on civil rights legislation, the Fair Housing Act, as governor. Then the Taconite Amendment that really jump-started the Iron Range was something he started working on as governor, and after he he was defeated, he just kept working on it. So in 1994, that was put on the ballot largely through Elmer's efforts. The creation of Voyageurs National Park was Elmer's project.
Very prominent on that.
You know, he continued to work on public affairs, civic improvement, long after his governorship. He and John Pillsbury, the other governor in the picture here, were I think the only Minnesotans that were governors, chair of the Board of Regents, and head of the Historical Society. And Elmer was so proud that he was following in John Pillsbury's footsteps to have those three roles.
Okay. Elmer was also a journalist.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain that aspect to his career?
Well, Elmer started his very youthful career as a high school kid needing some extra money, writing columns for the Muskegon newspaper in Muskegon, Michigan, where he grew up the son of a single mom, and decided at an early age that something he really would love to do is own a small town newspaper, which he saw as so contributing to community development and to democracy. And he held that goal in abeyance all the while he was working and then purchased and ran H.B. Fuller Company.
Very successful company.
Built that company and did a wonderful job with that. But when he retired from that, he went back to his first original goal, had never given up on it, bought the two newspapers, competing newspapers in Princeton, Minnesota, and merged them. And that was the starting of a company called ECM, which by the time Elmer passed, I think included more than 24 publications.
So, are there any Elmer L. Andersons on the scene right now?
Oh, I wish.
You wish? Huh?
I wish. He was a rare character, so able and yet so humble, and had a persuasive ability and a vision for this state. And I still think almost every day about some of the things he said. In the latter part of his life, he was concerned about the protection of our water resources. Such an environmentalist he was. Protection of our water resources at a time when he saw climate change coming, and he realized that there would be competition pressure on us to provide water resources to a growing population, and how it was important for Minnesota to both protect the quality of our water and to protect it from being diverted to other parts of the country at our expense.
It's still going on. Southwest wants our water, you know.
This was the kind of thing that Elmer was thinking about in 2002 and 2003.
Okay.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah. But you said something earlier that struck with me. Elmer worked across the aisle with Don Fraser. I mean, it's something I don't see that we have that much of anymore. Elmer really did put a premium on, you know, once he got into the legislature, I'm serving the whole state.
Absolutely. There was, I think, a bigger sense then than we have now, that after the election is over, you set aside some of the harsh rhetoric and set aside some of that fierce tribalism and really work on governing the state together. Of course, the legislature was nonpartisan then, and that may have made a difference. There are lots of things, though, that have made us more partisan in our politics, and that's, in Minnesota, that's one element of a much bigger story.
So I'm going to transition here a bit. You've seen a lot of campaigns, politics in Minnesota. We are just in the midst, coming up to the end of this election. What changes have you seen in the political dynamic in Minnesota and elsewhere?
Well, that extreme partisanship, that's the change I would point to, Paul. It's the case that we have, instead of just being in rival camps, we are now increasingly in enemy camps. And this isn't good for Minnesota. We have such a need to aggregate our resources, to maximize those resources that we have. That's how we've punched above our weight in this northern state all these years. When we are at odds with each other, and especially along regional lines, the Twin Cities versus rural Minnesota, we are depriving ourselves of some of our important assets, I think. That worries me. And that the way we operate our campaigns is now, I think, fueling outrage, anger, and tribalism.
But you said so much about the way campaigns are run now, you know, promotes that. Would you elaborate on that for us?
Well, when thinking back to Elmer's day, in Elmer's day, candidates did almost no fundraising personally. And campaigns, of course, were much cheaper. Legislative campaigns were run on shoe leather primarily, with door knocking being a long Minnesota tradition. One of the reasons we have such a large legislature, our New England heritage is part of that, but our desire for grassroots politics, literally at the door, door-to-door politics, is part of our desire for having the large legislature that we have. It's not the case anymore that candidates don't get involved in fundraising. To the contrary, our members of Congress, I think, spend more time fundraising than doing probably anything else. And the whole need to raise money, I think the consultants have convinced our politicians that you need to raise money by being as outrageous as possible to drive up people's animosity for the other side, to make them fearful of the other side. That tends to open up the checkbooks and get campaign contributions flowing. It tends to energize the base for voter turnout. I think it also turns people off, quite frankly. And that turning off.
That's dangerous if they don't show up.
And the turning off of people is part of the downside that we're living with right now. We've been having increasingly angry campaigns built on this notion of enmity, that we're going to demonize the other side, and the long-term consequences of that for our democracy are really not good at all.
So, you know, I'm a judge. I pay attention to what judges do in the Supreme Court. How much of an effect has the U.S. Supreme Court's decision that equates money and free speech?
Well, I was going to ask you, as a judge, how legally that could be reversed, because I think that is one of the several seminal problems here. When you talk about where we've gone wrong, this protection of political speech that the court has decreed, and the most recent, I think, case that it was major in this regard was Citizens United in 2010, which allows the corporate money to flow without unregulated and unfettered and undeclared in many cases.
I just read an article about the billionaires funding this campaign.
Yes, a record number of dollars flowing from billionaires this year, as you might expect. There's nothing to stop that. People in Minnesota are often alarmed by the volume and the tone of the political advertising that they see. But that advertising is being bought and paid for by people who have deep pockets, and it's fueling an outrage that keeps the money flowing. But I think it also drives down turnout. It keeps good people from running for office, and ultimately destroys respect for the enterprise of government. And that's really a problem in Minnesota, because government is one of the ways that we've come together to have that economic success I described a minute ago.
So I will answer your question. I don't think that there's much prospect with the current Supreme Court of changing that dynamic of money equals free speech, because too many people involved with those on the court, it's to their advantage and they want to see it. The only way I see it possibly changing is through the other two branches, the executive and the Congress saying, no, we have had enough of this. But I'm not sure the people are going to have the will to get people to make that decision.
Well, I actually would want to look to our voters themselves. The voters have been willing to reward this kind of campaign with their votes and their financial contributions. And unless that changes, unless we're so offended by what we see that we say, I'm not going to support that any longer, well, it's tough. And of course, what has come to pass is that both of our major parties, are using some of these same outrage-building tactics that are ultimately destructive of our democracy.
Why is it? I mean, Americans are decent people. They're smart and whatever. Why is it they are accepting and buying into this whole vicious downward spiral with respect to campaigns?
Yeah, well, Americans are decent people, but they are humans. And human beings are responsive to all kinds of emotional appeals. The entertainment industry has known that forever and has played on those appeals. And what has changed in so many ways, and social media is certainly part of this story, is that now our civic affairs are run like entertainment enterprises. Social media very much has a strong entertainment component to it. The tools of entertainment involve the stirring of emotions in a way that I don't think, back when I was a kid newspaper reporter 45 years ago, I don't know that we were encouraged to stir the emotions in quite that way. We were encouraged to report the news, tell what happened at the city council meeting today. Good writing always involved a certain amount of an emotional element, I suppose, but that was not front and center. I think it is front and center right now with social media.
Well, I want to do a pivot here to do something that's maybe a little bit more inspiring. You did this book on the Pillsburys. Why the Pillsburys?
Oh, that's so fundamental to Minnesota history. But I had been approached by George Pillsbury, former state senator George Pillsbury, with this idea that he would like to tell the Minnesota-specific story of his family. And he wasn't a writer, and he was looking for a ghostwriter. And then after we got going, he said, this shouldn't be a book by George Pillsbury with Lori, as typically ghostwritten books are. This should be by Lori, and you should be free, he said, to do the research that you want to do and point out the flaws and tell it the way you would as a journalist. And I happily accepted that challenge. So I think of this was maybe my 5th or 6th book, but this was, I think, the first to be by Lori, and that was a nice thing to have happen. George was helpful, but really the chapter 12 is really the only George memoir chapter.
Okay.
The rest really is stuff I learned about George's family. And the fun thing was to find something George didn't know about his family and go to say to him, George, did you know your great-grandfather helped found the University of Chicago? Well, no, he didn't. I think he floated for the rest of that day after I told him that. There are all kinds of things like that. The Pillsburys were, in many ways, a bit typical of the people who settled Minnesota or settled the Twin Cities especially, but settled much of Minnesota in the middle of the 19th century, in that they were New Englanders. They were interested in community building. They came here not to escape religious persecution, but to make money.
Yeah.
The Falls of St. Anthony was the only waterfall in the entire Mississippi River Channel, and it was a place that New England kids knew how to make money. Turning that into first a sawmilling center and then a flour milling center was something that came naturally to those New England
So they were the founders of the Pillsbury Flour Company.
That's right. And John Pillsbury was our governor in the 1870s. At a time when the state was stymied by its failure to pay a debt to
the railroad
the
bonds.
railroad bonds that we issued right after statehood and then regretted and reneged on. And our ability to borrow money from East Coast funding sources was being diminished, and one of the several positive contributions the Pillsburys made to our state government was to get us back into the good graces of our financiers so we could borrow money again.
I mean, and he blended his experience as a businessman with running government. But there's a story I like about him. I don't have a chance to tell the full story. But there was the grasshopper plague in southwestern Minnesota.
Yes, had been going on for several years.
And he went out there, and he was concerned about the Minnesota citizens.
That's right. And he personally, in the Christmas, I think it was, of 1875, he made a personal appeal through the state's churches to raise money and goods for the impoverished farmers in western Minnesota who had been wiped out by grasshoppers several years running at that point. And then I think was personally involved in amassing those goods at a warehouse that the Pillsburys owned and getting it shipped off. He did some of that shipping of delivery of the goods himself. But the other thing he did, I think it was in 1878, he declared a statewide day of prayer.
So this makes you wonder, do the Pillsburys have a direct line to God? Because they had a day of prayer to get the grasshoppers not to come. What happened?
And there was soon thereafter a late spring freeze, as you know in Minnesota we sometimes have, and the grasshopper larvae died and the plague was finally over. And there are folks who believed all from that point forward that indeed the Pillsburys had a direct line to God or the weather to get that to happen. It was, of course, a fortuitous circumstance, but it did secure John Pillsbury's place in state history in the minds of many people.
So we only have about 5 minutes left, but I want to focus on something we talked about earlier, about the concept of our elected officials being public servants. And the goal is not to get elected or accumulate power. You want to accumulate power in order to do good for the common weal.
You know, and I think there are still a lot of Minnesota elected officials who think about their service in precisely those terms. And then they get frustrated with this, again, the system that we have devised is a system that a lot of lower freshman or sophomore level legislators, especially, I think, get very frustrated with. They don't have as much opportunity as they expect to have to really make a difference on legislation. Too many decisions are made by the top leadership only and are dictated to them. They are told to spend their time fundraising. It's a focus on winning the next election as number one goal, and governing the state well too often is the number two goal. It's a frustration.
Yeah, well, I had these discussions with Warren Spanis, had them also with Walter Mondale, had them with Harold Levander. I mean, the people, they didn't like that the focus was on winning the election and not on what you did with your power. But you've written 12 books. 3 Minnesota Book of the Year awards, and you've been you seem to gravitate to some of these more stellar Minnesota public officials.
Well,
Rosalie Wahl, Joan Growe, and all. So we don't have much time yet, but okay, let's take.
Are you auditioning to be number 13, Paul?
No, I'm not doing this. I'm not in that league. Besides, you know, is that there are too many things where we intersect, you can't do it. But Joan Growe, for example.
Yes.
I mean, during the 1990 campaign, is that she served the public. What is there about people like that make them do what's right? They'll do the right thing.
Well, Joan, I think, had the great asset and something that we need to preserve in Minnesota, the independence of the office of the Secretary of State. Joan was able to stand up to the governor of her own party, as you'll recall, and was able to say, we're going to do what the law dictates here. We're going to do what's right in this regard, and get when a Republican gubernatorial candidate withdrew at the late hour in 1990, she was able to get a different Republican candidate's name on the ballot, and that candidate, Arne Carlson, won the election.
My whole career is based on her doing the right thing, you know.
Well, she did the right thing and was able to do so, I think, in large part because the Secretary of State is answerable to the voters, not to a governor who would have appointed such a person, but to the voters. Keeping that office independent is really important.
So we're winding up now with the last minute. What would you want to say to our audience of an encouraging nature about what to look for, what they can do about politics in the future?
Well, I think active citizenship has been a great blessing to Minnesota. It's part of our New England/Scandinavian heritage in the state, but it's something we, I think, have to keep building on as the state's population continues to become more diverse, to bring others along into this tradition of in Minnesota, we are really in charge of our own destinies here. If we're willing to aggregate our resources, if we're willing to work together, to put aside some of the divisions that are really not of our making and really ill-suited to our situation here in Minnesota, we still have great opportunities. I'd like to have the pioneer spirit of John Pillsbury be infectious. We have a great chance here to build the kind of state we want to have.
We can do that, can't we?
I think so.
Boy, that's a challenge that you're putting out there to our audience and citizens to be virtuous and make Minnesota what it should be.
Well, I understand that you've done some research about the virtues that were so important to our early founders of the state that they put some statues about virtues on the state
You'll see them at the Capitol. But that may be a story for another day.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lori. This has been, time went way too fast. We wanted to cover so much more. But I hope that the people, our audience, could understand what you have meant to our state, and by telling the stories of some of our most outstanding leaders.
Well, you're very kind, Paul. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you.